Well, here we are, BG. You guessed it, my friend. It's still salvage season. You know what that is. You gotta pay to play.
That boat's definitely not where it belongs, but that's not all that uncommon in boating. Plenty of times we'll go out there to enjoy our boating day thinking things are going to go just the right way, only to find ourselves in a spot that we don't belong. Just like some of the wild and crazy things we're going to witness in this week's episode of Boneheaded Boaters of the Week. Now, as we just witnessed, it really isn't all that difficult to wind up in a spot that you don't belong. I mean, especially here in this situation, how many mistakes did Captain have to make to get here? I mean, he was at the helm, probably should have never left that spot to begin with, and then did the second mistake of actually trying to jump for the dock versus stepping. I never recommend jumping to the dock. The only time it's really acceptable is if the gunnel's just that much higher than the dock due to the tide or the water level and you have to jump down. But even then, it can be a risky situation, and you really almost want to slide off that gunnel onto the dock, or you risk winding up on the ground or even worse in the water like our guy here. Now, this is another situation we see far too often anymore, where people wind up, again, in spots they don't belong, such as the water, but in this situation, somebody wasn't wearing the safety kill switch, and apparently the boat is now running wild, and that means, well, the boat's even gonna wind up somewhere it doesn't belong, as we're about to witness. Now, the ones you really feel bad for here are the guys who were on the sailboat as they believed they were in the right spot. They were just chilling, enjoying their day of sailing, only to figure out they were in the wrong spot. And that can happen anytime in boating. Sometimes you're just chilling thinking you're in the right spot, but you forget who's behind the helm. Now, sometimes being in the wrong place means that you thought you were heading into the dock, but you wind up hitting something a little different, or you're just standing around minding your own business and, well, something winds up hitting you. Now, sometimes being in the wrong spot might mean being hard aground. Now, you might be thinking, BG, that's not all bad, but you know what? Sometimes it is. Now, of course, falling from the boat to the ground is never a fun one, but something that can be even a little worse is falling from the sky into the water, especially when you don't expect it. Kind of like our guy here. He's out there enjoying himself, having a good time, but the equipment had another idea. And speaking of equipment, you never quite know what you're going to see out there on the water. Sometimes you're going to see some things come from the sky that you would expect, but they still wind up in the drink. And then, of course, there are those times where you'll see equipment you would expect to be in the water, but for some reason it's not. Now, I'm the first to admit, I've never trailered or tried to trailer a sailboat, so maybe this is more of a familiar spot than I would expect, but it's not often we see somebody with the captain's hat shoulder deep in the water, nor often that we see the pontoon trailer snapped in half at the stoplight. Now, of course, when we talk about seeing things that you might not normally see on or around the water, that can be a little bit regional. For example, it's not very common that you might see a U-Haul truck down there around the boat ramp, unless you live in Miami. If you're in South Florida, this is like an everyday occurrence. This is somebody's version of actually owning a truck, who's just renting a U-Haul every day to go ahead and tow that boat and get it dropped into the water. And speaking of dropping things in the water, something you would expect to see out there on the water is those outboard engines dropped into the water, but for whatever reason, it's becoming more and more common for us to see them trimmed all the way out with nobody even paying attention, motors running, and just letting it roll. Now, another thing you might not expect to see out on the water, though, is that guy going out there deciding he's going to cut across your bow when you're on a massive ship. Not the best idea. Now, something else that might seem a little out of place out there on the water is when somebody's going out there towing the tube, but you see the captain in the back seat, not quite exactly where you expect him to be, or when you see some cars that are out there actually in the water versus being on the beach or by the boat ramp.
Mayport jetties.
Now, you gotta let me know in the comments below, how do you think these even got out there? Were they left on a sandbar or a beach originally driven out there, and the tide came in and got them before they could move it? Let me know your thoughts. Now, I know your initial thoughts are, well, that doesn't belong there as well, but I'll tell you what, the more and more we watch videos around the boat ramp, I'm starting to firmly believe maybe the trucks do belong in the water, because we see plenty of them sunk all the time. Now, one thing you may not expect to see out on the water is a boat on fire. You're thinking he's surrounded by water. How does that happen? But honestly, it happens all the time. Now, the one thing you really don't want to see, though, is somebody on board that vessel. Fortunately, these officers were able to get him off without injury. Now, as we've mentioned a few times, some things you do expect to see out there on the water, kind of like a group out there fishing with fish on the deck of the boat, but you don't always expect to see the fish get on the deck in this manner. Though many fishermen may actually enjoy that because it might make their life a little easier when they're heading out there if the fish would just go ahead and jump in the boat. Speaking of jumping in the boat, it looks like nobody jumped in this boat as they went ahead and crashed into a bigger ship. I mean, they couldn't have missed this thing, right? It's sitting there and it's huge. Then, of course, speaking of not seeing things, some things you wouldn't generally see when you're out there around the water is something like this. Of course, we'll see people riding on jet skis, but not necessarily on the interstate going down the road. And definitely something you don't see very often is going to be, well, this. I couldn't tell you if I've ever seen something like this, at least not with a motor on the back. Now, while seeing a manatee out there drinking fresh water really isn't all that uncommon, in fact, many people will run water around their docks to try and attract manatees to come by. Don't know that I've ever seen one drinking fresh water coming out of a boat. Now, of course, you can go the opposite way, like where this boat's drinking the fresh water as it's going down the river. I have no clue how in the world this thing's staying afloat with that much weight on it. Or is this typical? Again, maybe it's not something I see that often, and every log-carrying vessel looks like this one is going on its way. Now, this one at first glance seems like nothing's wrong. This is something you might see on the water, a boat out there being towed by another boat, but it's definitely not often that you would see them out there under power, yet not moving. Now, of course, you will expect to see boats down at the boat ramp, but it's not often that you'll find boats sitting on the boat ramp, unless maybe you're in Florida. Again, a little more common scenario down there. But here it looks like they're trying to remove a boat that somebody probably left at the boat ramp. Unless they towed it over here because it was an abandoned vessel in the water. But I'm half wondering, based on this scene, if somebody didn't just tie this one up on the dock, leave it there, and this is how they're deciding to get it out. Not probably the best move. What do you think they should have done to pull this out instead? And as we've already talked about a little bit earlier, one thing you don't really expect to see very often is going to be a boat on fire out there on the water, but we see it all the time, especially down at the marinas. And one of the things you definitely see a lot down in the marinas is when you see a boat like this on fire, you'll see people cut the lines and push this thing off and let it drift away to try and save the other boats. Thanks for watching, crew. Hope you enjoyed this week's episode of Boneheaded Boaters of the Week. If you ever see anything crazy happening out on your waterways, be sure to hit us up on Facebook or Instagram at Broncos Guru and let us know, and you might see your stories over here. Just like Renegade Scott, Chris Larini, Sullivan Kemper, Christopher Blanford, Luke Osterkamp, and Dylan Bourget and Adam Coolidge did this week. And if you guys haven't already, go ahead and drop an anchor on the subscribe button here.